Hi folks, and welcome to Modern Horror. Join us, won't you? I feel like the time has come in my evolution as a reviewer to batten down the hatches, dig in, brace yourself, gird loins, etc., and discuss my first reboot. Now for reboots I have two rules. Number one, don't be a shitty movie, and number two, don't piss on the original or its fans. You follow those and we're gold. Now excrement-based metrics aside, I just think that any movie should have the right to fail on its own before being held to some other movie's standards. I get where the automatic remake hate brigade is coming from, since Platinum Dunes exists to greedily pump nostalgia dry, and that is awful, though it's not like they're the only purveyors of bad remakes. To the point, I just don't think it's fair to the genre or myself as a fan to automatically declare crap on anything sight unseen. Crap! So Bruce Campbell and Sam Raimi had wanted to remake The Evil Dead for years, but it seemed like fans wouldn't accept anything less than Evil Dead 4 with Ash Williams. And they gave up on the idea in 2009 because of the extremely negative reaction to something that didn't even exist yet. But eventually, Raimi and producer Robert Tapert came back to it and handpicked newcomer director Fede Alvarez based on the viral success of his short film Panic Attack. And in mid-2011, they officially signed off on the script written by him and Rodo Sayagas, with an uncredited rewrite by Diablo Cody to Americanize the dialogue. So with Raimi, Tapert, and Campbell all giving the project their blessing, the new Evil Dead started production in 2012, and Raimi went off to direct yet another several $100 million blockbuster. The original The Evil Dead, along with its confusingly similar sequel, Evil Dead 2: Dead by Dawn, were such seminal films to 80s horror that boiling down the premise of them or the reboot to a one-sentence synopsis is almost an exercise in redundancy. Case in point, the phrase "spam in a cabin" was invented by a review to describe that movie. Basically, 5 friends gather at a secluded cabin in the woods where they accidentally unleash an ancient evil that kills them one by one until a lone survivor manages to defeat the demonic force. Now be honest, how many movies did you just think of? However, the devil's in the details, and the Deadites are within the woods. So let's watch. Getting right into the action, this film opens on a young girl being chased through the woods, and did I accidentally put in an exploitation flick? The rednecks capture her, and she wakes up in a basement, confused and surrounded by strange people and her sweaty dad. I doubled down on the exploitation mistake, but I've seen some of those, and that's not how she would be tied up. I love how they handle this transition with her saying the line as part of her pleading before making it clear that she's possessed by pure dag-nasty evil.
Please stop! I will rip your soul out, Daddy.
I'll rip your soul out, you pathetic fuck!
Her father lights her on fire to save her soul from hell, and then shoots her to give her a merciful death since she's now on fire, and that kind of sucks if you're not a horrible demon. Well, this opening kill scene does introduce the new Deadites, now with 60% more vulgar, and the Book of the Dead. I think the movie might have been better served without it. I don't think there's anything wrong with the scene. It is effective at setting the tone, but I don't know if it's the right one. This next scene, following the Jeep through miles of lonely mountain road, should be a melancholy and uneasy introduction, but because we pitched so high already, that this becomes more of a relief. You know, the sun is setting, this creek is covering the road as it gets closer to the cabin, everything becomes more and more gray. But at least no one is immolating their teenage daughter or shouting in Turkish. The Jeep pulls up with a subtle callback to the Join Us shot in Evil Dead 2, just without the weird floaty eyes. And now a quick round of introductions for our Spam in a Cabin. Our lead character is Mia, a heroin addict. She's gotten her friends to take her to the family's old cabin so she can detox a place she can't easily leave, just to make sure it sticks. Also, obligatory mention of Sam Raimi's 1973 Oldsmobile Delta 88.
Grandpa?
Her somewhat estranged brother, David, has come up hoping to rebuild the relationship. David's fiancée, Natalie, seems to have no defining character traits. More on this later. The only person who actually seems excited that David is here is Olivia, a registered nurse who will cover the medical aspects of Mia's detox. And finally, Crank E. Pants. Okay, his name is Eric, but the man looks like he wandered straight out of 1974 and then drank orange juice after brushing his teeth. He's apparently some sort of school teacher, but his character basically is complaining about David. With our cast assembled, they gather around a well to give up halfway through a grand speech, which I'm choosing to read as a nod to Bruce Campbell's terrible improv
there, Sparky.
Excuse me. So what's the problem, inanimate object whose sudden sentience is absolutely no reflection on my mental state?
You have to mention the acrostic.
Do the what now?
An acrostic is when the first letter on each line of a text spells another word.
But every reviewer talks about that. I'm long-winded enough without pointing out silly screenwriter tricks. I already mentioned the car.
It's in the terms and conditions. Seriously. You'll see it. Small text, corner, Samaritan.
Well, I'll be damned.
Do ribs, or you will.
Okay, fine. The first letter of everyone's name, David, Eric, Mia, Olivia, Natalie, spells out demon. Spooky.
Excellent. Carry on.
I want to include the dog, Grandpa. What's a demong? Or what about the guy in the beginning? His name was Harold. Does that mean meh dong? Or the characters in the original all spelled out class. What does it all mean?
You ass.
I promise not to touch this shit ever again.
The lock on the cabin door is broken, but they just brush it off as local teens. You guys aren't gonna look around at all? Check the closets for serial killers? You vacation here as kids, you know there's a basement. What if Jason's down there planning a surprise party? With cake. Stabbings. Breezing through some character beats, we learn that the reason David's on the rocks with Mia is that while their mother was in the hospital during her last days, David was either unwilling or unable to leave his new job in Chicago to return to Michigan. Her dementia caused her to think that Mia was David for a whole day, something that probably really drove home that resentment. As the sun sets, David starts repairing the cabin by fixing the lock. Olivia pulls him aside and lays down the actual stakes.
We already tried this whole thing back in Flint last summer. Mia made the same promises.
She lasted 8 hours and quit.
David, when she breaks, we don't want to let her leave. She won't survive another OD.
Legally, your sister died. Came here to make things better with my sister, not worse. She asked me to take her home at some point. I'm gonna have to do it.
This whole time, Mia has been complaining about something no one else can smell, but when withdrawal starts kicking in, she gets pretty angry about it. However, Grandpa agrees with her and starts trying to pull up the small rug. David grabs it, revealing a large bloodstain on the floor next to the basement door. Poor Jason fell asleep and wax got all over the cake because they didn't look downstairs for 6 hours. Moving on, they find a whole bunch of dead cats, the shotgun, the Natron de Monto, and conspicuously no charred body of a teenage girl. I guess the townsfolk doused her and disposed of her body afterwards. Probably helped them avoid dropping a flaming cabin on their heads, especially after emptying 2 barrels of double-aught buckshot into a load-bearing beam. I guess come morning, Natalie is cutting the grossest-looking breakfast ham ever, while Cranky dooms them all to agonizing, painful torment and horrible death by going out of his way to read a scratched-out incantation from the book he found surrounded by dead cats, wrapped in barbed wire, bound in human skin, written in blood, and covered in warnings to explicitly not read this one part.
Kunda.
Stupid!
Cue a Raimi-style POV shot that rapidly runs up to the cabin and sucker punches Mia, who was outside.
Kunda.
This scene is very kinetic, with quick cuts and encroaching camera angles. It's a great way to ramp up from the more quiet discomfort of the past few scenes. Mia sees a strange figure in the woods call out to her and decides she's had enough of Survivor Detox Cabin, but everyone else bands together and refuses to take her home.
You're gonna have to stick it out this time?
Addicts, however, are sort of known to beg, borrow, and most importantly, steal. So she tries driving away in Mr. Cranky Pants' car, which she quickly crashes after another run-in with the figure. Now alone in the brush and facing down an evil palette-swapped version of herself, Mia is held by the vines for this film's version of the original's infamous tree rape. Now, Sam Raimi himself has said that he regretted including the original scene, but it is so well known that producer Robert Tappert insisted Alvarez include a version of it. Though this has a slightly more parasitic flavor. In an earlier draft of the script, Mia doesn't see her doppelganger, but instead runs over a possessed wolf, and the scene cuts on a much more ambiguous shot of coagulated blood coming out of the animal's wounds. I think the filmed version works better. It's a more interesting dimension for a heroin addict to be confronted by a dark version of themselves who forces a black tarry goo into them, which takes control and makes them into a monster. It adds another level of meaning and sets up the conflict as being symbolic of Mia's struggle to become sober. Back at the cabin, Olivia tries to clean Mia up and dismisses her description of the supernatural with the fuckery. Everyone's been pre-warned that addicts detoxing will want desperately to leave for a fix, be paranoid, may hallucinate, etc. This isn't a case of the horror trope where the characters ignore obviously strange behavior or dangerous conditions. They were expecting all of this.
Glad we were such assholes.
While David is clearing the decaying home decor from the basement, he finds Grandpa in pretty bad shape and a bloody hammer, putting this film at 2 for 2 on species of domestic pet death. Poor doggy. For some reason, he assumes that Mia did this, so she's in real hot water now. No, seriously. He tries to confront her while she's in the shower, but she's, doing demon stuff. So after breaking down the door, they discover the cabin's water heater can apparently go up to skin melting, and deciding that Olivia's diazepam stocks can't treat major burns, David tries to drive Mia to a hospital, except the slightly high creek from earlier is now a raging and uncrossable river. Having established a reason our cast hasn't just up and left yet, they return to the cabin for more of our regularly scheduled programming. But Mia interrupts the complaining Eric show by shooting David with a shotgun. A bit more throwback audio, and she delivers a threatening line before collapsing.
You are all going to die tonight.
Which is just a cunning ruse so she can attack Olivia and douse her in Berry Blast Kool-Aid before getting flipped into the basement.
Oh my god, what happened to her eyes?
Most of the callback lines I'm pretty cool with. They more or less fit in the new context here, but dropping the "what happened to her eyes" so soon after the attack not only completely lacks the insane effect and delivery as the original film, it makes no sense. The girl was drugged to the gills but woke up, shot your boyfriend, and projectile vomited like 2 gallons of bright red blood within the span of about a minute, and you're focusing on her eyes being kind of yellow?
Totally psychotic.
Olivia goes off to get some more tranquilizers, and while this scene foreshadows a bit heavily, I still love the execution of her being held unnaturally by some force.
Olivia?
Where's my diazepam, woman? Eric goes to check up on Olivia and finds her in the tub as prophesied by the mirror and the book, which is to say, sawing her face off. And now the movie begins its almost mean-spirited string of abuses afflicted on this guy. Ouch. After Mr. Cranky Pants smashes dead-eyed Olivia, David takes him to the shed where he tries to patch him up using somewhat unorthodox materials. And this is quite possibly the duct tape of truth, since Eric immediately cops to reading from the super creepy book, and maybe kind of sort of accidentally summoning demons from hell to torturously murder them all and bring about the end of days. Shit happens. Meanwhile, Mia tricks kind-hearted Natalie into the basement, where she nibbles Natalie's hand before the excellently disturbing licking the box cutter scene from the trailer and going in for some tongue.
Kiss me, you dirty.
David comes in just a second later and pulls Natalie out.
Why don't you come down here so I can suck your pretty boy?
With Mia securely locked into the basement, Mr. Pants tries to convince David that he needs to burn his sister alive.
Once he feasts on 5 souls, the sky will bleed again, and the abomination will rise from hell. If we want to help Mia, I think we're gonna have to kill her.
As they argue, Natalie's back in the kitchen, and her wound looks pretty rough. A demonic infection starts to take over her hands, so she lops the thing off with an electric kitchen knife. However, it's a cheap Chinese knockoff, so blood gets into the electronics and shorts the power for the whole cabin. David tries to patch Natalie's sawed-off arm with duct tape. Back in the Boy Scouts, we like the saying that duct tape and twine can fix anything, but we never tried applying this wisdom to the first aid merit badge, and I think with pretty good reasons. But if this works out for David, I may need to reconsider. Cranky goes over the way the book claims that they can save Mia's soul.
Alive burial, bodily dismemberment, and purification by fire.
David is still worried that she's just gone crazy like their mother, though if that's the explanation, then insanity is communicable, and he must have it since he just watched a book in a fire not burn. This whole scene is probably one of my favorite scenes in the entire movie in terms of horror, so I really wanted to pick it apart. While Eric is yelling at David for refusing to face the problem head-on, Natalie reappears as a Deadite. Now, Raimi's original Deadites were sort of merry tricksters with a mildly homicidal bent, especially in Dead by Dawn, but Alvarez's are absolute fear and intimidation. I really like that only Mia talks, and that gives her a sort of ringleader feel, but the other Deadites show through displays of brutality that they're still playing with the other characters because they can, and because terrorizing them is more important than just killing them. To that end, Deadite Natalie announces herself by using David's nail gun to drive several nails into her own face, and slowly taking aim at Eric. And they don't move because, I mean, fuck, that's terrifying. Then, as David tries to go for the shotgun, he sees her lurching up in the warped reflection of the cabin and the TV and turns around to see her towering silhouette showing off a crowbar. She beats on David until Eric distracts her, and I love this demonic, "oh no, you didn't" face. This attack where she rips Eric's hand in half is probably one of the most wince-inducing moments in the entire movie. And then she keeps going until David blows off her last arm. Now, I don't know if this counts as bodily dismemberment or if the demon decided to vacate simply to let Natalie's torturous death torture David, but it is gut-wrenching. Shiloh Fernandez might not be the best actor here, but the twitching face and stroking her hair do a really good job of selling the fear, pain, and confusion he's got to have. The scene had a ton of visual flair with the lighting, Natalie coming in and out of shadows, the framing to keep things tight, uncomfortable angles and close shots to keep you uneasy. It's super disturbing and intense.
Come on, man.
Anyway, Mr. Cranky's taken quite a lot of abuse and is pretty much down for the count, so David takes him outside so he can prepare to burn down the entire cabin, sister and all. Mia's singing an old song their mom liked, which makes him chicken out at the last minute. So instead of purification by fire, he thinks he can go for the live burial and then resuscitate her. Though I kind of feel like that's cheating, but alright. So he prepares via montage and then heads into the basement to sedate Mia, even though it really didn't work very well last time, you know, when she kind of got up and shot him. She's a pretty slippery one though and starts flinging David around the basement willy-nilly. It's not looking good for his plan, as Mia is now drowning him in a well in the corner, but Eric is surprisingly still kicking and knocks her out.
I'm not dead.
Though Mia managed to get in one final poke, and the box cutter is what finally does him in.
Yeah, that ought to do it.
He's taken a pretty absurd amount of abuse in the movie, and even though he read from the book making all this suffering sort of his fault, it is kind of sad to see him go. But he does shuffle off this mortal coil after finally admitting his true feelings for David. Moving on to the live burial portion of the evening. Using some of the woefully underutilized Deadite psychological warfare, Mia delivers a pretty heavy zinger.
I know Mother hates you now. And she waits for you in hell.
Don't cry. Don't cry. This tree extinguishes itself at a good dramatic time, and David starts sticking Mia out. Now, amazingly, David's plan does work, and after a slight faint, she comes back to life with the last bit of juice the car battery can provide, which for some reason completely heals all of her burns and bisected tongue because... magic. Well, I guess there is a flip side to giving credit where it's due, and movie, this one is your bad. Death apparently being a get-out-of-burn-scarring-free card aside, David goes back inside to grab the car keys, and while he's distracted by an old picture of the group, the now deadite Eric stabs him in the neck with a pair of wire cutters. He staggers away and warns Mia out of the cabin, and as he collapses against the door, he shoots a gas can with a shotgun, and the whole place goes up. Mia picks up the necklace he had given her in the beginning, which provides a nice target for the first drop of blood rain to hit her as shit goes completely tits up. Just as Mr. Cranky described earlier, having feasted on 5 souls, the skies rain in blood, and the abomination arises as an emaciated doppelganger of Mia. Unfortunately, just like the healing thing, the movie isn't very clear about how this works, but there are actually a number of theories to attempt to explain it. The one I like best is that feasting on the souls doesn't necessarily mean turning the person into a deadite, just that they've died and been taken to hell. So the abomination is being fueled by the souls of Olivia, Natalie, and Cranky, taken as deadites, David as a suicide, and part of Mia's soul. If we go back to the whole story and possession as an addiction allegory, most addicts will say that even when you're clean of something, the temptation to do it again never really goes away. So in this case, Mia may have been exorcised, but her soul will always be incomplete, further evidenced by her losing her arm later. There's also another theory that hinges on Grandpa's doggy soul counting, and that works pretty well. I can also use it to explain why the Eric Deadite speaks, because if the dog soul counts, then you can make 5 from Grandpa, Olivia, Natalie, Eric, and Mia's partially nibbled soul, so he gets to 5 before David dies. There are a few others, but they operate on deleted scenes or scenes from the script that were never filmed, and I don't think you get credit unless the work is actually in the final copy of the test booklet. In our action-packed finale, Mia fights the demon while the production crew secures their place in the Guinness Book by using a world record 50,000 gallons of fake blood during this scene alone. She tears her own arm off to get away after the demon traps her under the Jeep, then grabbing the chainsaw, she drops a one-liner and shoves it into the Abomination's face, pretty much cutting it in half. Defeated, it slips back into hell and Mia limps off into the rising sun. And now that the movie is over, we can look back at my original criteria for a good remake. First, be a good movie. And Evil Dead is a good movie. Everyone here was on their game, and all the technical points worked. The story was interesting enough and mostly consistent, so I was able to overlook the minor inconsistencies that were there. Overall, I feel like it strikes a very dark, hopeless, and disturbing tone, and it makes it a very scary and unsettling movie. Fede Alvarez gives the whole thing a lot of style, especially in the more intense sequences. If we're looking for something to play against the movie, its mythology isn't super consistent, and there are a few things that could have been explained better. The opening kill probably would have better served the movie by its removal, and the movie's characterization is also a bit sparse. Probably because a lot of other character relationship scenes were removed in favor of focusing on David and Mia's relationship, and also to make the story more about Mia than David. There's a large removed chunk about David and Eric's old band, though Natalie probably had the most cut from her, but I think it actually improved her character. There's a draft of the script available online where there's a subplot about David's lack of ability to commit, which mostly manifested in Natalie constantly complaining that he hasn't set a date for their wedding yet. In fact, her last words were supposed to be, "You promised you'd marry me," which just made her so incredibly one-note and almost turned what I felt was a really memorable scene into a joke about, men think monogamy is a kind of wood, am I right? Second, does this movie shit on the original or its fans? Now, obviously, this is a bit more subjective, but I don't think this does. Both the original script and the movie that made it to the screen are full of little references and homages. Some do feel a bit shoehorned in, but none of them seem like they're just there to try to curry favor. I really get the impression that Alvarez and Sayagas are fans of The Evil Dead. They even renamed the book to Naturom Demonto, which was Raimi's original name before it spent 2 movies as the Necronomicon Ex Mortis. I think some people were taken aback by the really dark themes and horrifying tone, since Dead by Dawn and Army of Darkness are so well regarded and they push the tone really far into camp and slapstick. But the original movie was marketed as the ultimate experience in grueling terror. And if you watch it again, the Deadites are a lot more nasty and menacing than they get later. Probably the best evidence of this respect is that it tries to be its own thing. The story isn't an exact beat-for-beat duplicate of anything from any of the other movies, and there are no character equivalents. None of these characters are Ash, no one is a stand-in or a reworked Cheryl. It takes the one-sentence synopsis and gives it a new take, with its own characters and its own meaning. Now, the Evil Dead franchise is filled with great movies, and I do count this among them. It's kind of different seeing an Evil Dead movie done with a budget and without all the camp, but it really worked for me. So if you're interested in more, subscribe below, follow Build Environment on Facebook or Twitter. Cheers, folks. Thanks for checking out some modern horror. Klaatu Barata Necktie.
The flesh will be torn, you'll be dead by dawn.